a well-deserved break. To quickly recap, we feel as a government very positive about the Pacific mission and what we were able to achieve while we were away. We had very broad discussions with the leaders of Tonga, Samoa, Niue and the Cook Islands, but of course a particular focus on climate change, Cyclone Gita, severe weather events, and the additional assistance that was required to tackle those. Also a very strong focus on support for ongoing economic development, particularly in Samoa, around microfinancing for businesses and so on, but also a theme around alternatives to the current use of diesel generators in the likes of Nguyn, also improving electricity infrastructure in Tonga and the like. So overall, a positive mission from the perspective of Deputy Prime Minister and myself. I want to speak briefly to the issue of the President of the United States and tariffs on steel and aluminium. You'll be well aware of the issue now and the potential impact. Ministers are actively working, including the Honourable David Parker, on seeking an exemption for New Zealand and our steel and aluminium exporters as we speak. We have what I would characterise as an important and broad relationship with the United States, not unlike Australia, so we believe we have a strong case for an exemption. I think that case is enhanced by the fact that we are clearly not a target here. Our exports of steel and aluminium to the United States are very small, 39 million and 23 million respectively. So small from the United States perspective, but not small for those who are exporting. We believe they pose no threat to American steel and aluminium manufacturers. Of course, also, the US has a trade surplus with New Zealand. They send us $60 million more in exports than we, $60 more in exports. So from our perspective again, some of what the President is rallying against, we are not the target of. All right, just a quick recap of the week ahead. Obviously, the Minister for Trade and Export Growth and myself happy to answer questions on that. On Tuesday, tomorrow, I have a bilateral with Prime Minister Phúc of Vietnam. This is my second meeting with the Prime Minister, having also met him at APEC in Da Nang last November. There will also be announcements this week from Minister Hipkins on terms of reference for the review of tomorrow's school. On Thursday, Minister Jones will be making further Provincial Growth Fund announcements. On Friday, I'll be speaking at Pacifica before opening Toy Art, the refreshed National Art Gallery of New Zealand at Te Papa. So that's a bit of the week ahead. Happy to take questions.
Prime Minister, government insurer Southern Response engaged a private investigative firm called Thompson and Clark to spy on victims of the Christchurch earthquake. Is that an appropriate use of taxpayers' money?
No, it is totally inappropriate. That is why the Minister has referred that to the State Services Commission to investigate. There is no doubt that was not an appropriate action.
Thompson and Clark have been caught doing spying operations before. Do you think that other government departments or organisations should be using them?
Absolutely not. In fact, we had a very brief discussion amongst a few ministers this morning to seek out that they make sure that none of their departments are engaging Thompson and Clark in the same way, because their behaviour around spying and so on is totally inappropriate.
So you're effectively banning government departments from using them?
I'm seeking out that everyone assures themselves that they're not being used for that purpose.
Just on Winston Peters was on The Nation on Saturday. Do you agree with his view that Russia, there's not sufficient evidence that Russia meddled in the US election?
Well, actually, I've looked at the entire transcript of that discussion, and it strikes me that a lot of the conversation that the Deputy Prime Minister was having was around first and foremost, New Zealand being able to access trade agreements in a fair way relative to other countries. Look, when it comes to the issue of other countries' elections, of course that one particular issue is playing out very publicly, and it's for everyone else to make the judgment based on the evidence that's building as to whether or not they believe that's the case.
But do you agree with him?
That
There's not sufficient evidence that Russia never really used it?
Oh, again, it's not for me to pass commentary on other people's elections, but obviously there is a continuing public discussion over what exactly happened and trying to bring transparency to the issue.
Do you share his view that there is not sufficient evidence to name the Russians as being responsible for the downing of MH17?
Well, obviously, if we look at the process that's being undertaken now, we've obviously had the first joint investigation team response. No one is disputing the evidence that the plane in question was shot down by a Russian-made missile. That is not in question. What is still underway is the second part of the report to determine who was responsible for that.
Do you think Russia was responsible?
No, obviously there's another piece of work building evidence around who exactly it was. So I'll be eagerly awaiting, as will those most affected by that incident, as to where the evidence points to. But there's no dispute that it was a Russian-made missile.
Do you have any concerns in light of these comments and the fact that the EU Commissioner did visit last year, apparently in relation to concern over New Zealand's position towards Russia, that this could have an effect on the EU FTA?
No. And let me clearly restate our position again when it comes to trade generally within Europe. We as a government are prioritising the EU FTA, and there is good reason for that. We're seeking a mandate this year to proceed with that negotiation, and are very hopeful about that. Now, the reason for that being a priority is obvious. The scale of that FTA is significant. But what the Deputy Prime Minister has pointed out is that while sanctions have been in place, there have been other countries within Europe who have traded around those sanctions and have been able to do so. Now, New Zealand has applied the spirit of the sanctions, but of course we have a number of non-tariff barriers that apply still to us in that trade exchange that we're seeking to overcome. And just make sure that New Zealand is treated fairly in the same way that others have been trading around the sanctions, as is appropriate.
Do you have any concerns about how often Mr. Peters meets with the Russian ambassador or the nature of that relationship?
No, and I have to say, I mean, of course, the Deputy Prime Minister is responding to questions that are being asked. So this isn't something that's frequently being raised. He's more often than not responding to questions when he's answering about this particular issue.
But do you know how often he meets with the Russian
I certainly heard questions asked of him, probably would have been a couple of months ago in that regard. But no, I mean, because the reason I have no concern is because the context in which he's discussing this issue is simply around New Zealand's access relative to other countries. And of course, as I say, we are prioritising the EU FTA.
What about the parallel he made with Australia and the fact that there are barriers for him to, is that a fair comparison?
In comparison to...
He said that because of the detention issues with holding people there, that they too have potential barriers to a trade deal with Australia. Therefore, could that be comparable to Russia?
I would need to see the context of those comments, sorry, before I answer that.
Prime Minister, what do you make of these two foreign fighters, Kiwis, going to Syria to fight against the Islamic State?
And although I didn't see that report, I am aware of it. And look, MFAT's advice for good reason remains that Syria is a hugely dangerous area to enter into, and that we would advise against travel into the area. It's an extremely risky venture to undertake.
Are they doing anything illegal?
Look, I haven't had specific advice on that, but that wouldn't change my advice that just don't go. Regardless of the purpose, do not go.
How many Kiwis are fighting against Islamic State?
I don't have advice on that. I'm not sure whether or not we would be able to quantify it. We probably know how many, I imagine, are in Syria, possibly, but whether I wouldn't be able to quantify necessarily their activities.
What do you like to discuss tomorrow in your bilateral with the USD?
I imagine that we'll continue on with the conversation that I had last time I met. We have a number of arrangements around support for things like their exports of dragon fruit, so a number of little initiatives like that I'd be keen to check in on how they're progressing to make them even tastier. But also we have an existing comprehensive agreement with Vietnam, and each time we meet we have talked about the potential to upgrade that to a strategic partnership. So that's the foundation for our dialogue.
What's his interest in New Zealand?
I believe he's travelling in the region more broadly at the moment. But of course we have a significant relationship, both from a trade perspective but also export education. And when I was in Vietnam and in Da Nang, I met a number of those who had come and particularly accessed our higher education and then returned to Vietnam, brought economic benefits to Vietnam from that, but of course contributed to our tertiary education system at the same time.
Prime Minister, on the steel and aluminium issue, the Australians, Malcolm Turnbull, solicited the support of Greg Norman's golfer. Have you thought about Bob Charles here, that frequently Donald Trump gives a shout out to?
Look, it's fair to say ministers are working hard on the issue and seeking to use a range of different avenues to promote New Zealand's case. The Minister for Trade and Export Growth has been dealing explicitly on that. I don't believe Bob Charles has been on his list. No, but you know, in the same way that Australia has sought an exemption, we are seeking an exemption for all of the reasons I've outlined. And whilst we'll use most avenues, I don't think we've resorted to golf as yet. I'll take that on board. It's creative.
If the EU could become Donald Trump's chief economics advisor, he hails from Matamata, just up the road near Morrinsville.
That's right.
Did you know?
No, I did not. They are at least 20 minutes apart in two distinct townships. Whilst often confused, Matamata horses, Morrinsville cows. Just if you want to remember the difference in the
Do you
future.
think it could be helpful if he became the chief economics advisor?
Matamata is a horse town,
Yes,
Claire,
yes, I know.
and Morrinsville's a dairy country. I'm just explaining for Claire. Do I think it would be helpful that he's in that position? Look, only time will tell. I guess it very much depends on his existing ties, the degree to which he wants to use his personal connections to New Zealand and highlight those with President Trump. Look, if anyone internally is able to acknowledge and champion New Zealand's cause, then that's helpful. But I wouldn't. I don't have any expectation around that.
I've met Chris Lidell, and he is a loyal New Zealander. He's one of the people who was behind Predator-Free 2050 initiatives by a large philanthropic fund. I would have thought that he would be wanting to do his duty by his new employer, but also do what he could for New Zealand.
What do you think he could do for New Zealand as the chief economic advisor?
From the advice that we've had, this is primarily from the Americans' point of view a security issue rather than a trade issue. We are, of course, pointing out, as the Prime Minister has said, that that America has a small trade surplus with New Zealand, that our exports of steel and aluminium are very small, and that we are a security partner of the United States in various ways. The Prime Minister asked the Minister of Foreign Affairs and myself to both be working on this issue, which we are via a number of routes, not all of which I will detail today, but we are doing our utmost to attempt to have New Zealand get an exemption from these provisions, because we think that would be good for us.
If you look at what's driving this, though, I mean, President Trump frequently talks about trade deficits in those trading nations where he believes that the United States is getting a raw deal. From what you've heard me outline today, New Zealand is not one of those nations and will be making that case.
The countries that do have an exemption at the moment seem to be Canada and Mexico for reasons connected with the ongoing renegotiation of NAFTA. Why should
they actually had steel? America had a steel trading surplus with both of those countries.
Indeed, but because
So they
of
wouldn't want to
NAFTA,
tip their carriage to
they've got an exemption in the meantime. We don't have any such strong card to play, do we?
Oh, well, as the Minister for Trade and Export Growth has just explained, I mean, If there is a surplus in place, then that obviously becomes an argument that's useful to make, because they wouldn't want to see a tit-for-tat regime with either Canada or Mexico.
But the surplus argument doesn't play with any other countries. Why should it play with New Zealand?
Well, I think that was one of the points that the Deputy Prime Minister was making in the weekend, that there are some legitimate complaints on the part of the United States that there are other countries who are inconsistent in their application of open trading arrangements. New Zealand isn't one of those countries. We're very consistent, and that's something which should count in our favour in addition to our security ties.
Do you hold out much hope, really? Because, I mean, Trump seems to be saying, little or no exemptions.
It would be very foolish for me to give up here.
When did you start seeking these exemptions, David Parker?
Before we left for Chile, so it was within a day of it being announced.
You
Sorry,
pulled the idea of getting, Charles and their creative. Are you using any other creative solutions?
We are acting appropriately.
Just back on
Mr.
Chris
Parker, can I
Lidell,
ask-
David Parker, you said he was a proud New Zealander. How could Chris Lidell work for New Zealand in the Trump administration?
I'm not about to put him into a position of conflict between his role acting for the President of the United States on economic policy, but I was just making the point that he's a good person.
Mr. Parker, 3,000 Kiwis have signed a petition asking for an inquiry into Kevin Rudd's allegations. And they're coming to Parliament tomorrow, are you any closer to making a decision on that inquiry?
We are closer to making a decision on that.
Can you give
but
them
we
a timeline?
I said a week ago within a month, so in the next 3 weeks or so.
If the EU FTA is a trade priority for us, what's our current thinking on the permanent arbitration court that the EU is very keen on? They want that as the